There we go.
Right. The Norman Conquest. There's a picture of the reference book that I've been using for this presentation. Very interesting. And it starts off by saying, for 150 years after the time of Alfred the Great, people were continually fighting one another all over England. What the country needed was a strong king who could keep order. That's what we needed. Now, there is difficulties in using the Lady Bird series for history. Most of it's absolute rubbish. But it's also difficult using contemporary sources because of the time, because they were all naturally biased depending on who or where they were written by, and they weren't shy in showing the bias. And even something like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, there isn't just one Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, there's several with different versions written in different parts of the country, which support different factions in Anglo-Saxon England. Right, so the first person to really do a deep dive on the Norman Conquest was this guy, a Victorian nonetheless, because of course he was, and Edward Freeman. Now, the attitudes to the Norman Conquest had changed over the years. Immediately afterwards, all Anglo-Saxon chroniclers everything was terrible and awful, etc. But when England became embroiled in wars with France in the 14th and 15th centuries, and again in the late 17th and early 18th, the Anglo-Saxons were then seen in a more positive light by contemporary historians, and then it's the Victorians with Edward Freeman, who does his huge, big volume, 6-volume, or there's 5 there, but there's 6, History of the Norman Conquest, and that influenced historians for years to come. Mr. Freeman, he believed in the purely Teutonic nature and superiority of the English nation. And he asserted that the Anglo-Saxon invaders of England had largely killed or driven out the original Celtic inhabitants, although he did admit that the women were doubtless largely spared, which sort of flaws his argument somewhat. He was also a racist, even by the standards of his time. And in a letter to a friend describing America, he wrote, "This would be a grand land if only every Irishman would kill a Negro and be hanged for it." And he was also an anti-Semite. So that was him. Oops. So coming off the histories, this was the popular ideas of what happened at the conquest. England before the conquest was an ideal state. It was lovely and rosy, and the kings were elected, part-time army, and everyone was happy. Earl Godwin of Essex typified England. His son, Harold Godwinson, who was become King Harold, was a skilled politician, popular, fearless, etc. Even though he went to war, he understood the horrors of it, and he only took the crown reluctantly. The Normans, on the other hand, were a cruel, warlike people, and their autocratic ruler, William the Bastard, was the cruelest of all. Edward the Confessor was weak, devious, irrational, etc. And he always preferred Normans to Saxons. And as for him promising the crown to William, he never did really. But if he did, he didn't mean it. And anyway, if he did mean it, then he changed his mind and chose Harold on his deathbed. And then Harold would have won Hastings easy, but he was tired and shagged out after fighting at Stamford Bridge. And anyway, the Normans cheated. They used cavalry and crossbows and archers, which the Saxons didn't have. Well, they had a few archers. After the conquest, England became a terrible place to live. But eventually, Englishness came through and we're all happy again. So, England in the early 11th century, before the conquest. In the 980s, after a period of relative peace for the time, Danish raids began again in earnest. First they came in small parties as done in the past, raided, retreated, and took the loot with them. But in 991, a large Viking army landed in Essex and defeated the English army that was set out to meet them. And from then on, the Vikings returned to burn, pillage, and plunder on a regular basis. And by the time of Edward the Confessor's birth, the violence had become almost a matter of routine. Under the year 1006, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that the Vikings did as they want. They did as they want to. They harried, burned, and slew as they went. And these Danish armies were actually bigger and better equipped and better organized than the previous ones. And it didn't help at the time that the king was Athelred, known to history as the Unready. Edward the Confessor was his son by his second marriage to Emma, sister of Duke Richard of Normandy. In actual fact, Unready is a misreading of the original nickname. This came up in the wordplay on Saturday, actually, which it was the old English word unread, meaning bad counsel, because Alfred means good counsel. So it was like a pun, good counsel, bad counsel. That's a Saxon joke. Athelred at first put his faith in churchmen, but they regarded the Viking attacks as divine punishment for wrongdoing the Saxons had done. So their solution was a spiritual one. So they wanted more prayers and more gifts to the church. In the meantime, large payments of tributes were made, called Danegeld, and they were given to the invaders to make them go away. But of course, this only encouraged the Vikings to come back, because every time they came back, they got more Danegeld. They didn't have to do much to get it. Athelred then changed his mind and embarked on a more confrontational policy. He gave orders that ships should be built throughout the kingdom. However, the English aristocracy was riven by feuds and rivalries with disastrous consequences. When Ethelred finally got a newly constructed fleet together and it put to sea, arguments broke out between the factions. 20 ships deserted and then attacked and destroyed the remaining ships. So that was the end of his attempts at a navy. Finally, in 1013, the Danes invaded, headed by their king, Sven Fortbeard, and this time they wanted outright conquest. Ethelred fled to Normandy. Sven died pretty soon after seizing the throne, and Ethelred was invited back by the Saxon council, the Witan, under condition that he would rule in a different manner. As the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle said, no lord was dearer to them than their rightful lord, but only if he would govern his kingdom more justly than he had done in the past. The Danes initially were defeated, but then the same factions in England began to quarrel, and there was a round of killings at the court. Ethelred died in 1016, and his eldest son by his first marriage, Edmund, known as Edmund Ironside, became king. But he was defeated by Canute, who's Sven's son. At first, they shared the throne, but then Edmund died and Canute became king on his own. And he began eliminating his enemies and potential rivals for the crown. Ethelred's wife, Emma of Normandy, then married Canute and became Queen of England for the second time. Her sons with Ethelred, who were Edward and Alfred, once again fled to Normandy. So if we have a quick look at Emma, she turns up to be quite an important person at this time. She was the wife of two kings of England, of Anglo-Saxon England, Ethelred and Canute, and she was the mother of two other kings, Arthur Canute and Edward. She was a key political figure in her own right and a major force in the very turbulent politics of 11th century England. And her political influence proved to be have far-reaching consequences. But of course, her importance and influence was, until very recently, largely ignored. At Canute's death, there was a succession struggle between Emma and Canute's first wife, whose name I can't really pronounce, but I think it's something like Elfgifu, on behalf of their sons, Arthur Canute, who was Emma's son, and Harold Hereford, who was the other wife's son. Edward and his brother Alfred were not even considered at this time. But once it seemed that Harold Hereford was going to triumph, Emma persuaded them to each make a bid for the crown. Both failed, and Alfred ended up dead after being captured by Earl Godwin, who had switched allegiance from Arthur Canute to Harold. But then Harold died, and Arthur Canute was crowned, and then he was ill. And as he basically knew he was dying, he invited Edward to come back from Normandy to be his successor. So Edward gets to come back and be king. Now, there is just, you can see how complicated it can be, because all the different houses, these are the Danes over here, and there's the Saxons, and there's Emma, sort of in the middle of it all, with and the different offspring there. But the most powerful of all the English earls was Godwin, Earl of Essex, and he benefited greatly under Canute. When Canute was king, he had created four great earldoms, which were reproducing the old English kingdoms of Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria. Over time, these earldoms became dominant power blocks ruled by dynasties powerful enough to challenge the king. In the early years of his reign, Edward the Confessor agreed to raise Godwin's eldest son, Sven, to an earldom in the southwest Midlands. 2 years later, his second son, Harold, had been handed control of East Anglia. And then, more significant was the fact that Edward married Godwin's daughter, Edith, And it just seems that Edward realised that to stay on the throne, he needed to appease Godwin and keep him on side. At first, everything seemed calm, peaceful. But in 1043, there was a rumour that his mother, Edward's mother, Emma, was plotting to replace him with Magnus, King of Norway. Edward has always been worried about the possibility of a Scandinavian sympathisers lurking in England. So he banished the niece of Canute named Gunhilda, along with her 2 children, and sent other supporters into exile. Edward was probably responding to a mix of fears, present and past grievances. These people may or may not have constituted a genuine threat, or simply may have been the victims of an exercise by which the effects of the earlier Danish conquest were gradually undone. By 1051, tension between Edward and Earl Godwin had come to a head over the appointment of a new Archbishop of Canterbury and the issue of foreign alliances. It's thought that the marriage of Edith was unconsummated, so there was no chance of an heir. And this was then compounded by the promise made by Edward to Duke William to succeed him after his death. There's been some dispute about that, but I think the consensus now is that he did actually promise Duke William the throne after his death. The dispute between Edward and Earl Godwin got out of hand at an instant at Dover, when Edward's brother-in-law and the town of Dover had a fight, basically. Eustace, his brother-in-law, and the people of Dover had a disagreement. People were killed. Edward ordered Godwin to punish the people of Dover, but he refused. This resulted in both raising armies, but at the last minute, the threat of another civil war caused Earl Godwin to reconsider, and he ended up banished along with his sons. Edith was sent off to a nunnery. An alliance was sealed with Duke William, and feeling secure, Edward then disbanded the mercenary navy he had relied on for defence. Now that was a mistake, because then Godwin and his sons were able then to invade England and force Edward to return their titles and power. Edward's Norman advisors fled back to Normandy. And even when Earl Godwin died, nothing really changed. His eldest son, Harold, simply took over the family's power, the family's earldoms, and their power was maintained. And there you see, that's England at the time of Edward's Confessor, with the different Harold in Wessex, and then other ones in Mercia. That was the House of Leofric, and that's the House of Godwin. Right, so now we come to Harold Godwinson, some background on him. He was a mixture of Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Danish heritage. He became Earl of Wessex in 1053, and by the early 1060s, he, along with his brothers, were the real power behind the throne in England. He even initiated a surprise attack on Gruffydd ap Llywelyn, the King of Wales, who he managed to kill. And when Gruffydd was killed, it was Harold, not Edward, who appointed a new client king to rule in his place. Harold's younger brother, Tostig, was Earl of Northumberland, but in 1065 his cruelty caused a rebellion, and the rebels raised an army and marched south, demanding that Tostig be replaced and banished from England. Harold did all he could to try and appease the rebels and to save his brother, but what Harold was not prepared to do was fight the rebels for his brother's restoration. Edward ordered a royal army to crush the uprising, but no army was forthcoming. And it must have been Harold's own refusal to commit his men to a fight that caused the acceptance of the demands of the rebels. So Tostig was deposed and sent into exile. So Harold, he's the most important earl in the land. And there's a strange thing where in 1064, but more likely 1065, Harold ends up as the guest of William of Normandy. Exactly why Harold sets off overseas is uncertain, but he was caught in a storm and shipwrecked on the coast just further north of Normandy. And he was seized by the ruler of that region, Count Guy, who imprisoned him, hoping for a ransom. However, Duke William got wind of this and forced Count Guy to surrender Harold to him. Harold then accompanied William on a campaign in Brittany. And more importantly, he swears an oath to uphold the Duke's claim to the English throne. Again, there's no doubt that this actually happened, as it was confirmed by both Norman and English sources. What is disputed is why it happened. According to the Norman writers, the swearing of the oath had been the whole point of the exercise. William of Poitiers, who's a Norman writer, said that Harold crossed the Channel because he had been sent by Edward the Confessor to confirm William's claim to the English throne. But English sources maintain that the Earl had never intended to visit the continent at all, but had accidentally been blown across the Channel, having set out on a fishing trip. But a more credible alternative is then offered by an early 12th century monk of Canterbury named Eadmer, who wrote that Harold had set out for Normandy, but had done so on his own initiative, his purpose being to obtain the release of two relatives who were being held hostage at William's court. I mean, as I said at the beginning, both accounts obviously suffer from bias. William of Poitiers maintains that Harold gave the oath clearly and of his own free will, while Eadmer claims it was done under duress and he could not see any way of escape without agreeing to all that William wished. So, Duke William of Normandy. William was the illegitimate son of Duke Robert and Herleva, who, according to legend, was a daughter of a tanner. But it's now thought that her father was probably of higher standing, possibly a burgher. That's spelled B-U-R-G-H-E-R. A rank or title of a privileged citizen of a medieval town. And they formed the pool from which the officials could be drawn. William's nickname was the Bastard, but he was chosen because he was chosen by his father to be his heir when Duke Robert went on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. This wasn't unusual in those days. It became less acceptable shortly after this. But in then, being illegitimate didn't work against you so much. Well, Duke Robert went off to the Holy Land on a pilgrimage, but he never returned. And in 1035, William became Duke at the age of probably 8 or 9. And he survived due to the support of his great uncle, Archbishop Robert, as well as King Henry I of France. But he wasn't fully secure in his dukedom until 1047. Then Edward dies. Edward had little or no power in England when he fell sick in December 1065. It was clear he wouldn't last much longer, and he died on the 5th of January 1066. And the next day he was buried, while Harold became the first English king to be crowned at Westminster Abbey the abbey that Edward had spent his life building. Questions then and ever since have been raised about to the legitimacy of Harold's claim to the throne. It lies on the assertion that on his deathbed, Edward appointed Harold his heir, and that the Witan, the council of Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, chose him. It was also claimed that Harold was reluctant to take the crown, but did so out of a sense of duty. Primogeniture, the right or by law or custom of the firstborn legitimate child to succeed to the throne, was not practiced in Anglo-Saxon England. When the Witan met to confirm the next king, the candidates were all from the royal household, but the choice of the heir was the most suitable. Now, if the predecessor had chosen a certain person, that carried a great weight, but that was not actually binding. Even with the Danish invasion that saw two royal dynasties, any claims had to come from within the two royal families. In heredity terms, Harold's case was extremely weak. He was related to Edward Confessor, but only by his sister's marriage. His claim, therefore, was to rest heavily on the nomination by his predecessor and the election of the Witan, which, according to the pro-Harold sources, is exactly what happened. Other sources are more ambiguous, saying that Edward only asked Harold to protect the kingdom, not rule it. As for his election, we know that the new Earl of Northumbria, Morcar, and his brother, the new Earl of Mercia, Edwin, were present, and they must have supported Harold just 8 weeks after their rebellion had seen his brother Tostig exiled. It seems certain that some sort of deal was struck at this point, because by early 1066, Harold was married to Edwin and Morcar's sister, Ealdgyth, even though he had a long-standing relationship with a woman called Edith Swanneck, with whom he had several children. The main obstacle to Harold's ambition was Egda Aefling, the son of Edward the Exile, the great nephew of Edward the Confessor. Lots of Edwards. Egda was directly descended from Alfred and Athelstan, the early kings of Wessex in England. The dynasty that dynasty had ruled Essex. This fact, combined with the considerable efforts that had been required to secure the return from Hungary, where they were exiled, led many to expect that it was Egda who would succeed Edward. After all, the title accorded to him in contemporary sources, Atheling, indicates that he was considered worthy of ascending the throne. Moreover, one chronicler maintained that Harold himself had sworn to the Confessor that when the time came, he would uphold Egda's cause. Now, whether this was true or not, the mere existence of this legitimate heir was especially awkward for Harold. The saving grace was that in the autumn of 1065, Egda was apparently no more than 13 years old, and all Harold needed was enough of the other English earls and magnates to agree that Egda's right should be set aside. And this is why it's thought that he promised to marry Edwin and Morcar's sister. The incentive being for them that they would produce children, and the fortune of the two formerly rival houses would have a new royal dynasty. And Harold's coronation was on the day of Edward's burial. And this also points to a deal being made. No previous king of England had been in such a desperate hurry to have himself consecrated, for the good reason that in England, the coronation was never been regarded as a fundamental part of the king-making process. Normally, many months would pass between the process of election and a new ruler's formal investiture. Edward the Confessor had come to the throne in the summer of 1042, but was not crowned until Easter the following year. Harold's rush to have himself crowned within hours of his predecessor's death was therefore quite unprecedented, and suggests he was trying to buttress what was, by any reckoning, a highly dubious claim with an instant consecration. Now we have a lot of the what we know a lot of from this time comes from the Bayeux Tapestry, even though it's an embroidery really, but it has been used as a source for many years. The news that Harold had made himself king, of course, didn't go down well with William. He saw it as a betrayal, a violation of the fealty and the sacred oath Harold had sworn. The Duke's immediate response was to send messengers to England urging Harold to renounce the throne and keep his pledges. Harold, unsurprisingly, chose to ignore them. William then had to claim his inheritance through force of arms and invade England. He pleaded his case to the Pope based on Edward's promise and Harold's oath, and probably played on the Pope's resentment of the English Church, which was known to not toe the line so much. A harder task for William was to convince his fellow Normans to support him. He had the backing of his closest councillors, such as his half-brother, Bishop Odo of Bayeux, but found it more difficult to convince the rest of the Norman magnates to support what was a very risky invasion. There were concerns over the superiority of the English in terms of wealth, soldiers, and their navy, and the acute fear of a channel crossing, which wasn't a simple thing to do in them days. The Normans, despite their Viking heritage, were not known as seafarers. Finally, although his subjects accepted that they owed him his subjects owed him military service, they weren't bound to serve him beyond Normandy. Precisely how William won over the more sceptical of his subjects is unknown. Certainly, one of the inducements that was put forward to the Normans was the enormous material rewards that could come to them should the plan succeed. According to William of Poitiers again, the Duke pointed out that Harold could offer his men nothing in victory, whereas he, William, was promising those who followed him a share of the spoils. This may explain why, in the end, the Normans agreed to having the terms of their service written down. For the greater the service rendered, the greater the eventual reward. But then there's a complication. Harold knew all about William's intentions, but first came the news of his brother Tostig landing with a force on the Isle of Wight. He was seen off by a combination of Harold, Edwin, and Morcar, and he fled to Scotland. Harold then began to assemble a huge force of both on land and sea to prevent an invasion. Men were positioned all along the south coast, and the navy was off the Isle of Wight ready to intercept. All through early 1066, William prepared his invasion fleet and his army of perhaps 7,000, although chroniclers at the time said there were 60,000, but they did tend to exaggerate somewhat. He was ready by August, but the wind was against the crossing. On the 8th of September, Harold was forced to stand down his army. The troops, we are told, were given permission to return home. The king, who was on the Isle of Wight, sent his fleet back to London and then set out for the city itself. He must have hoped that whatever was delaying William would continue to detain him a little while longer, because very soon it would be too late in the year for William to even attempt a crossing. But when Harold arrived in London, he was greeted with the news that his brother Tostig, along with the Viking, King Harold Hardrada, had landed in the north. Like many others, Harold Signesson was given the nickname Hardrada, hard ruler, much later. He was an impressive figure and has been called the last true Viking. He was forced to flee Norway as a teen and ended up spending several years at the court of Yaroslav the Wise, King of Russia. He rose to great power and eminence by rendering military service to successive Byzantine emperors. His reputation and his fortune won, he returned to Scandinavia in the mid-1040s and used his well-honed skills to make himself King of Norway, where he subsequently reigned with a fist of iron and fighting his neighbours and executing his rivals. Some historians believe that he'd always set his sights on invading England, but it seems more likely that he only decided to do so at the urging of Tostig in 1066. He landed on the Yorkshire coast near the River Ouse and linked up with Tostig, who came down from Scotland. Their aim was to capture York. They were met by an army assembled by Edwin and Morcar, and they defeated it. They then went to York, and it seems the citizens of York had surrendered without a fight and obtained good terms. Many of the people in York were of Danish descent and seemed to prefer Harold Hardrada to Harold Godwinson. They then regrouped, marched south, and camped at a place called Stamford Bridge. Meanwhile, King Harold had wasted no time. He had marched north, gathering levies as he went. He arrived at Stamford Bridge while the Norwegian army was resting, believing they were under no threat, and in the ensuing hard-fought battle defeated them. There was a terrible slaughter, and after the battle, the bodies of thousands of Englishmen and Norwegians were left in the field where they had fallen. More than half a century later, a scribe wrote that travellers could still recognise the site on account of the great mountain of dead men's bones. Both Harold Hardrada and Tostig died in the battle, and Harold Godwinson retired to York, no doubt to ask them why they surrendered so easily. But then the Normans arrived. The well-known story is that adverse winds prevented William from launching his invasion feat. Later, some historians argued that he deliberately waited, knowing Harold would have to disband his army at some point. The consensus is now that it was the weather that prevented the crossing. In fact, William had made one earlier aborted attempt to cross and had nearly lost his fleet and when it was blown further up the coast. On 27th of September, William set out and landed in Pevensey. The Normans immediately began plundering the surrounding countryside and they secured Hastings. Harold probably learned of William's presence on the 1st or 2nd of October while still in York. The most likely scenario is that he rode south with his huscarls, which was his professional guards. They were professional mounted warriors and the core of the army. And Lee left his foot soldiers behind. He sent messages to raise a new army, and then on reaching London, rested and began gathering his forces. William and Harold both knew where each other was. They actually exchanged messages at this time. In a deliberate attempt to draw Harold into a battle, the Normans began indiscriminately plundering the countryside. Harold, contrary to the advice given to him by his counsellors, took the bait and left London before his full force had gathered. He may have been thinking that if he moved quickly, he could take the Normans by surprise, as he had done with Harold and Tostig. Now, various chroniclers give differing reports on the size of the opposing armies. Of course, each side claimed that the other had superior numbers, but most likely, given how the battle went, they were probably evenly matched. So the battle itself, what we know for certain is that Harold took a position on the top of a hill and formed a shield wall. This was a traditional method of fighting for the English. His men were all on foot. The Normans had archers and crossbowmen in a line. Behind them were helmeted soldiers armed with swords, and in the rear were the Norman cavalry. The battle went on all day, but at some point, a few of the attacking Normans broke and ran, either as a trick or for real. Is debatable. But what definitely happened was a section of the shield wall followed them. At the same time, a rumour circulated that William was dead. But he wasn't. He managed to rally the Normans, and they turned and slaughtered the following English. Eventually, with the shield wall compromised, the Normans wore down the English resistance, and they broke once Harold was killed. We will never know how Harold died. The popular story is that he was killed by an arrow in the eye. This has been challenged, and earlier accounts claim that William organised what amounted to a death squad to target Harold, and he was cut to pieces. The fact was that William needed Harold to be dead, because otherwise he would have carried on resisting. Harold, on the other hand, had no reason to go and fight a battle when he did. So after the battle, the old story is that after the Battle of Hastings, William went to London and was crowned. He then set about his rule, and a bit later, a guy called Hereward the Wake led a rebellion in the Fenlands around the Isle of Ely in Cambridgeshire. The truth was that apart from Pevensey and Hastings, every town and city in England remained to be taken. London was actually packed with warriors, some of which were doubtless the troops summoned by Harold that had not arrived in time of his premature departure. Others were survivors from Hastings, and they were determined and defiant. With Harold gone, the only plausible candidate was Edgar Atheling, and it was said it was indeed his right by birth. He was, as I said, the great nephew of Edward and the last of the ancient royal line. But as events earlier in the year has shown, a teenager with a strong claim could easily be elbowed aside by a powerful man. Support from the Archbishop of York was useful, as was the allegiance of the Londoners. But for the boy to have any hope of success, he would need more friends and more muscle. The only individuals in London that autumn in a position to lend such strength were Edwin and Morcar, the brothers who were Earl of Mercia and Northumbria. What they have done since is unclear, since they were defeated at the battle by Harold and Tostig. And no one's sure if they actually fought at Hastings. But on reaching London, they reportedly got Harold's widow, Edelglyph, their sister, out of harm's way. But they also gave their backing to Edgar Atheling. The Normans proceeded to Romney and then Dover, burning and pillaging as they went. Other towns, such as Canterbury, surrendered, but London refused. William then ordered his army west and continued his campaign of laying waste the south of England. At some point, Edwin and Walker left London with their men and headed back north. This seemed to be the final blow, and Edgar and his nobles submitted to William, and who was crowned on Christmas Day in 1066. Rebellions continued to erupt in several parts of England and carried on throughout 1067, culminating in a major revolt led by Harold's mother, Geafa, and some of his sons from his relationship with Edith Swanneck. This was finally put down after William captured Exeter, where the rebels had gathered. At first, William did try to accommodate the English aristocracy by letting them retain much of their lands for a price, but their power was diminished by the appointment of Normans to key positions and the building of castles throughout England. This resulted in growing resentment, and a fresh outbreak of rebellions was the outcome. These were again put down, and in the winter of 1069-1070, William conducted the harrying of the north, where larger areas of northern England were laid waste, and there was indiscriminate slaughtering of animals and people. So much so that there was a resulting famine in 1070, in which many more died. That was when Hereward makes his appearance. Unlike the old story, which is one of a purely Anglo-Saxon resistance, Hereward was working in conjunction with the army of King Sven of North Denmark. Sven quickly realised that a conquest was untenable, and after several old-style raids to gather plunder, he reached terms with William and sailed away. The revolt was then crushed by William personally, but Hereward escaped into legend. From then on, William decided that he had to impose complete Norman control over England. All remaining Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-Danish earls were replaced with Normans, and the whole ruling elite was effectively replaced. So, the Norman legacy. What changed and what didn't change? Well, the first thing is language. There was a sudden discontinuation of English as a written language, with the King's writing office abandoned, and the long-established practice of using English was disposed of around the year 1070. The reason is that most men of power by that date were French, and therefore could not understand it. From then on, Latin became the language of the royal chancellery, and English was soon abandoned in the monasteries. One version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle ends in 1066, another stops in 1080, leaving only one to carry on till 1154. English would ultimately emerge again, its variety increased by its freedom from written consonants, its vocabulary massively enriched by thousands of French loanwords. And in order to prosper amongst the massive English majority, the few thousand Norman settlers must at some point have realised they had to learn to speak English, if only as a second language. Some linguists would go as far to regard English that we speak today as a sort of Creole language created by the social circumstances of the Conquest. And it's this language that eventually gave rise to Chaucer and later Shakespeare. Architecture. Churches, you can see the difference there between the Saxon and the Norman buildings, the church buildings. Churches and other buildings changed. By 1087, no fewer than 9 of England's 15 ancient cathedrals had been burnt down or demolished, and new Romanesque replacements were rising in their place. In the course of the next generation, the remaining 6 would also similarly be rebuilt, along with every major abbey. The sole exception, of course, being the Confessor's Abbey at Westminster. And then we come to castles. The Normans at one point were called the castlemen because they built so many castles. The Anglo-Saxons didn't build castles, but hundreds were built after the invasion across England and used as bases to project Norman power and domination. England had never witnessed anything like it. Famous royal fortresses like Windsor, Warwick, York, Norwich, Winchester, etc., and the Tower of London, of course, all have been founded by the conqueror himself, along with scores of others too numerous to list. Across the country, wherever new Norman lords of any substance had settled, similar castles have been erected in their hundreds. Because they're so difficult to date with precision, the total number remains an estimate, but at conservative count, around 500 were in existence by the year 1100. The overwhelming majority of them having been built in the years immediately after 1066. The ruling class. As I said, the entire Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was replaced with Normans and their supporters, something that endures to this day. There's some of their descendants right there. By 1086, the English were entirely gone from the top of society, supplanted by thousands of foreign newcomers. This transformation, as I said, had not been William's original intention. His initial hope seems to have been to rule with a mixed Anglo-Norman kingdom, similar to how King Canute had ruled with Anglo-Danish one. Canute had begun his reign by executing those Englishmen whose loyalty he suspected and promoting trustworthy native Englishmen in their place. William, by contrast, had exercised clemency after his coronation and consequently found himself facing wave after wave of rebellion, and replaced all the nobles with his Norman supporters. This was a relatively easy process, given that England had the most sophisticated bureaucracy in Europe, developed through the need to raise money during the various Viking invasions. This also made possible for the Domesday Book to be compiled. And the Domesday Book shows the change in ownership of land from Saxon to Norman. England was effectively reorientated from looking north to Scandinavia, as it was under King Canute, who ruled England, Norway, and Denmark. And it was linked in trade attitudes from then on to the European mainland through Normandy. Society. In general, the two different cultures collided. It was not just facial hair that distinguished the English from the Normans, but a whole range of practices and attitudes. Take, for example, warfare. Wherever we look in pre-Conquest England, the emphasis seems to be entirely naval. Edward the Confessor defends his people by sailing out from Sandwich every summer and is appeased by a gift of a great gilded warship. Taxes are raised on the basis of crew sizes. Fleet and army are virtually interchangeable terms. We seem really to be looking at a model that is much in common with Scandinavia. By way of total contrast, to read the sources for pre-conquest Normandy is to enter a world dominated by cavalry and castles, which came to dominate in England. Feudalism was introduced, and the relationship between the peasants and their lords was changed forever. New laws were introduced to reflect different attitudes towards inheritance, favouring the firstborn son, so that the patrimony remained intact. Surnames derived from places which had formerly found no place in pre-conquest England. The surnames suddenly appear after the conquest. In their determination to carve out new lordships, the Normans treated the surviving English harshly, forcing many men who had formerly held land freely to become rent-paying tenants, often on extremely bad terms. In contrast, the fortunes of those at the very bottom of English society were actually improved. Slavery, which was already a thing of the past in Normandy, had been going strong in England. After the 1066, there was a sharp decline. Part of the reason can be attributed to economics, with the Normans preferring to have serfs holding land and paying rent, rather than slaves who worked for free but required housing and feeding. Another reason was certainly that some sections of Norman society felt that slavery was morally objectionable. William himself had banned the slave trade and was said to have freed many hundreds on his expedition to Wales. By the 1130s, slavery was gone in from England, and some contemporaries attributed its absence to the conquest. It used to be said that slavery in England was around 2% of the population. That has now been revised upwards, and historians now think it was around 20%, with some arguing it could have been as high as 30%. A longer term consequence is that slavery was still practiced in Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, and this gave rise to the idea that they were not as civilized as the English, and so that was justified future subjugation. Along with the belief that slavery was wrong, the Normans introduced the notion that it was better to spare one's opponents after they had surrendered. The English had been practicing political murder right up to the eve of the conquest, but very quickly thereafter, after the practice disappears. No man dares slay another, says the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, praising William's law and order policy, no matter what evil the other might have done him. With the sole exception of Earl Wulfulf, no Englishman was executed as a result of the conquest. And after this, in 1076, no earl was executed in England until the early 14th century. The other thing that it gave the Norman conquest gave rise to was the idea of Merry England, medievalism. Because in the later 17th century, the idea of the Norman yoke emerges. This is that the English were free until they were subjugated by the Normans. And this was revived in the 18th century. By the 19th century, it carried on in popular history, conjuring up an imagined Anglo-Saxon golden England. Sir Walter Scott wrote a novel called Ivanhoe, where the Saxon proverb is put in the mouth of one of the characters. Normans saw on English oak, on English neck a Yeoman yoke, Norman spoon to English dish, and England rules as Norman wish, etc. So this gave rise to the myth of Merry England, and that was further enhanced into popular imagination by motion pictures and Hollywood's portrayal of the depiction of medieval England in films like Robin Hood and His Merry Men, Ivanhoe, and later on even The Knight's Tale. So the whole Norman conquest, that's where this idealized Merry England with the poor Saxons and the nasty Normans comes from. The end.